Can you hear me, Bob? Okay. As always, there's a prayer on top of the handout. Please pray with me. Christ our Lord, giver of light and wisdom, who opened the eyes of the blind man and transformed fishermen into wise preachers and teachers of the gospel through the gift of the Holy Spirit, shine also in our minds the light of the grace of the Holy Spirit. Grant us discernment, understanding, and wisdom in learning. Enable us to abound in every good work. We give you all honor and glory. Amen. Okay. Before we begin, I'm going to do a little advertisement. So if you are able, we have a really good speaker this afternoon for the Faith Formation Speaker Series. He's a pastor at First Pres Bowling Green in Ohio. PCUSA, a pastor. And he has done a couple of trips down to the U.S.-Mexico border with the PCUSA, and this has a really good, he's actually done it on TV a couple of times, but he's got a good presentation about what the PCUSA is doing, and moreover how we can think about what the Bible says about things like immigration and borders. Yes. We've actually invited the older kids in the youth group to come, so they might want to come up with them. So, okay. So what we're going to do today, I got a handout for you. It's got two biblical passages on it, and I want us to look at these passages through the lens of what we talked about last week. So if you were here last week, we talked about that the Gospel of Mark is more than just a story of what Jesus did, right? It's not just a biography. It's actually a manual of discipleship, and we're kind of supposed to put ourselves into the story. And I'm going to use these two passages to illustrate how this works. And I got this ready earlier this week, and this morning I decided I want to turn the order around. So we're going to look at the ending first, right? But the two passages are I call this a beginning and multiple endings. The beginning passage is Jesus' first parable, which is the parable of the sowers, or of the sower, or I think it's better titled the parable of the soils. That's really what it's about. But I think a fun passage is the endings of Mark. Maybe you noticed this when you finished reading Mark this week. Of what I've tried to do for you here is give you at least what the NRSV, which is our Pew Bible, does, which is we get the first 8 verses, and then we get this a section that doesn't have a number, which is called a shorter ending. And then we get verses 9 through 20, which is if you grew up using, let's say, the King James, this would be familiar to you. This is how it would end. We get verses 9 through 20, right? I don't want to put anybody on the spot or shame anybody, but because maybe not everybody's had time to do the reading. I admit I'm a couple days behind myself. I think I'm about 2 days behind. But even reading this in the English translation, verses 9 through 20 don't seem Markan, right? I mean, if you've read an author enough, let's say you've got letters from a loved one, you kind of get to learn their tone, the words that they use, their grammar, the sequences in their writing. This doesn't match, right? Mark doesn't talk like this, right? It also seems like this is what you would get if you went and read Matthew, Luke, John, and maybe Acts, and wanted to write a summary of what happened at the ending, which is probably what happened, right? So I think it's actually, I'm going to read the first 8 verses, and just pretend the rest of this doesn't exist. So, when the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they might go and anoint him. But Jesus has died. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had arisen, they went to the tomb. They had been saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb?" When they looked up, they saw that a stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, there's a place they laid him. Here is the place they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Right? That's the end. How's that for the Easter story? That's how we're going to end what we do on Easter morning. Right.
That was it.
Right. It's, on the one hand, it's a pretty terrible ending, right? Because what's our reaction? What if you're watching a movie or you're... Yeah, where's the rest of the story? Like, what happened, right? Where's the sequel? I mean, what's going to happen, right? This is what we want to know. If this is the ending, right, it's a terrible one, right?
I like it, though.
Why?
I think it's more powerful than the other Gospels. It's a fitting bookend to the beginning of Mark. The beginning of Mark is very abrupt.
Yep.
Nativity, all of a sudden here's John the Baptist. Boom.
Yep.
And we get to the end, and there's an empty tomb. And as we close the thing, it's over.
It's over.
So we have those questions. What happened before John the Baptist? What happened after the tomb? But it's very powerful. It's very stark, I think.
Right. No, I think it is too. And
if you read it to a child at bedtime, very nightmare.
Right.
Plus, we have perfect hindsight. We know we must have told something,
right?
Because otherwise we wouldn't have a church.
So this is, and now we're beginning, I think, to understand how this ending could have actually worked, right? I think it's one thing that's helpful is to think of how would the original people who had this gospel even use it in a world in which maybe 10% of the population can read. So where would they have, how would they have experienced Mark? They would have experienced it orally. It would have been read to them. You would have gone to a church service, and what would have happened is the entire gospel would have been read. You'd sit there and listen. Yep.
Yeah, that oral aspect of Mark is very strong too. I think let me just digress it a little bit.
You're fine.
There are 5 canons of rhetoric. These are not big guns, they're books. But invention, arrangement, style, memory, delivery, these were the 5 arts that were taught in ancient rhetoric. And memory is a particularly interesting one because they developed systems they had tremendous systems for aiding memory. And one of them was you memorize a building and you memorize every portico, every little room, everything. And then if you wanted to remember something, you put those stories in those spatial locations and put a little icon of some sort in your mind in those places. So when I taught at Gordon College back a few decades ago, my office was in an old hunting lodge, but it was a big stone hunting lodge. And it was very intricate. You walk in these big doors, and so I memorized that. And it says on the beginning, the gospel according to Mark. That's what it says on the doors in my head. You walk in, there's this pool, a reflecting pool inside. And what's going on there? Well, there's John the Baptist. Yeah. He's in the pool. So I memorized all these little sections, not word for word, but just thought by thought, and put them in this elaborate building. And I used to be able to. I didn't keep it up. but I used to use it as a party trick. Say, you want to hear the Gospel of Mark?
Yeah.
And then I would go through and say, well, first this happens,
Yeah.
that happens, and what? And then I would say, you want to hear it backwards? And then I just go backwards because I'm just walking through the building and seeing these icons.
Yeah.
So I imagine that in the early church, disciples were encouraged to memorize the gospel.
I think that's probably true, and I think that's, I mean, again, for the first 100, maybe 200 years, that's probably how the average person experienced this text. Was a person got up and didn't even have a manuscript; they had it memorized, and were orally giving it, right? And then they would comment on it. It's actually, I mean, our form of preaching, where we have a text, and the pastors basically give you a commentary on the text for this personal context. Right? That's kind of how preaching developed. They're already beginning to do some of that, where they would pause and explain something, or the audience could ask questions. And some of this is already happening, but that's how you would have experienced this. So you get to the end of this story, right? And there's, I mean, if you've been paying attention, right, there's some interesting things happening, right? I mean, there's irony all throughout Mark, in terms of people don't get things as we've seen. But so think of the fact that throughout this whole gospel, Jesus has been telling people, shh, right? Don't tell anybody, and they go and do it anyway. Well, here the opposite happens. We get to the end, Jesus tells these women, go tell Peter and the disciples. But then we're told they didn't tell anybody anything because they were afraid, right? And it ends that way, right? Well, the first thing we should all ask is what Linda pointed to is, I mean, if you're sitting there hearing this, you're going to go, well, wait a minute. Somebody told somebody something, because we're hearing this story, right? That's how they would have, reacted in, let's say, the year 50 or whenever this is, right? It's probably a little bit later than that, but also how we should react, right? Because somebody told somebody something, because we're here, 2,000 years later.
I thought it was interesting in verse 7, he says, go tell his disciples and Peter.
Yeah. So I mean, so there we can really get into like the weeds, right? So I mean, and actually, let's actually hold on to that just for a second. I'm going to come back to it. It'll make a sense.
Peter's the rock of church.
Well, right. So this is part of it. But if you look at the shorter ending, as we can dive into it, like we'll talk about where these endings come from. But what I've given you on the page, like if you go grab our Pew Bible, I'm trying to put this on the page as best as we could, right? This Pew Bible is going to do the same thing. It's got verses 1 through 8. And then it puts these two different endings in here, and it puts them in these double brackets, which is a code to say, these are here because if we don't put them in here, someone's going to get angry at us. Because it's here in the history of the tradition, but then you'll get footnotes, especially if you have a study Bible, which will explain something to the effect of, in the best ancient manuscripts, these verses aren't here. Because they're not, right? It's, almost universally accepted that these two endings are added. And a shorter one's actually added later. We think it was written sometime in the late 3rd century. And the longer one either at the end of the 2nd century, early 3rd, right? And they're written because it ends so poorly. Especially when you begin reading it rather than hearing it. Right? And especially when you have become aware of there are other Gospels which have an ending. I think a big part of what's happened here is it bothered people that, hey, the other Gospels have endings to them. The story has a bow tied on it. It's ended. Right? Mark just... Right? Actually, in Greek it ends in a preposition. So it actually, it's like an incomplete sentence, right? And there are all people that propose theories that there was an ending and it got lost, or someone really early hated it and tore the page out of the scroll. I mean, we don't know, right? But I think it actually makes sense to say this is how it ended. And one thing that would have happened is the person who reading it or giving it from memory would have then explained what happened, interacting with the audience. The audience would have got to ask some questions, right? But these kinds of things would have happened. But we do get these endings added. And I actually use this passage often to teach our students the basics of what we call biblical criticism or textual criticism, right? And this is how some of that works. So at some point there was an original manuscript of the Gospel of Mark. It was written by John Mark. This is the paper, the papyrus. He wrote it on, somebody made a copy. And a couple of copies got distributed. So let's say all of us are given the task of making a copy of the Gospel of Mark to bring back to our churches. We got these copies, right? And then that copy gets old a couple hundred years later, right? And copies are made of that copy. You can see where this is going to go, right? But at certain points, people begin maybe taking notes in the margin, right? Sometimes those would get added in. This doesn't happen very, very often. But what we can actually tell is there are families of texts. So, most of the big manuscripts that we have are between the 5th and the 10th century. So they're copies of copies of copies. But we can tell, this was probably the original text that all of these copies came from. And then here's this one where all these other copies came from. Because they have the same errors in them or the same unique features, right? So the earliest ones we have, we can tell that they didn't have these endings. It just ended with verse 8. But then we can tell people gave us these endings. There's only one manuscript that only has the shorter ending. Just one. So that one didn't catch on. But they didn't like that one. We get a lot of them that only have the longer ending, and then we get some that have both of them. So they're aware that this problem is there very early on. We actually get the notes in the margins of, I'm going to put this ending in here, but I know there are some other copies that don't have it. We don't know what to do with it. They'll put asterisks around it and all these kinds of things, right? So they're aware there's a problem very early, right? Part of what these endings do is potentially add things that the original author didn't intend. One is that the story has a nice resolution, right? And it turns it into a story or a history rather than this manual of discipleship, right? We also get the addition of Peter. So 200-300 years in, right, we're beginning to get this idea of Peter is the rock upon Jesus is going to build his church, and he's the Pope, and all other church leaders have to kind of come through his line. So it makes sense to add Peter in, right? So you see the endings give Peter a role, and actually on verse 7, the best manuscripts don't say end Peter. They say go tell his disciples.
But it doesn't get bracketed off.
Yeah, because they're almost equal, right? But the earliest ones don't have it, and so they.
Well, how does that compare with John 8, with the story of the woman taken in adultery? Were they bracketed off?
So that one is even more. So this is, if you don't know, John. It starts at 7:53 to I think 8:11. We get a story in the Gospel of John of a woman who's caught in adultery. It moves in the manuscript tradition. It'll be in different places in the Gospel. Sometimes it's at the very end, and occasionally it ends up in the Gospel of Luke. So we actually get a story that moves. They don't know where to put it. It's there. At some point, somebody added it to the Gospel of John, but it clearly isn't written by John. We can tell by looking at vocabulary and style. It doesn't fit. But it's a story that was clearly so important to the church early on. They appended it. They just added it in, right? These things kind of bother people. And if you were really interested, I can walk you through. This would be too hard to do just to talk about it. But like this is my Greek New Testament. And on the bottom of the page, like this is the English over here, but like that's just the biblical text. All of that is like notes. And what almost all of those notes do, it's all code. You got to like the keys in the front. It'll tell you. In this verse here, there are 10 manuscripts that read like we have in the text. There are 8 of them that don't have the word "and" in it here. It's that detailed, right? So most of the differences are very minor. It's like the word order is turned around. Greek doesn't need, like we have to have in English, right, a subject, verb, object, because Greek has tenses and cases. You can move the order. You can have the object first. You can go object, a subject, verb. You can go object, verb, a subject, right? It's just different. So they'll tell you, like they turn the word order around, or they put the adjective before the noun instead of afterwards. It's usually very minor things. But occasionally you get these great big ones, like that story and this. These are some of the biggest ones, right? So I'm hinting perhaps we're already kind of getting this post couple hundred years. We're going to add a couple things in to defend the papacy and the Catholic hierarchy, right? That kind of things, those kind of things happen, right? But also what's happening here is we're getting the gospel actually ends for Mark on this note of, what are you going to do? That's how it should actually end. If we're putting ourselves into a story, if we're supposed to think like we're one of the apostles. Here at the end, we're supposed to put ourselves in the shoes of the women. The angels appeared to you. The tomb is empty. We're being told, go tell Peter and the disciples. What would you do? I think their response is pretty normal. My initial response is going to be like, they're going to think I'm crazy. Am I crazy? I might think I'm crazy, right? So ending this way is it makes a sense. Again, if we put ourselves into their shoes, we think we might do this too initially, right? If we go read the other Gospels, of course, it's the women who do eventually go tell the disciples what they've seen, right? Which is what we get in the additions here to agree, right? So they wrap this up, right? But the way that these two endings wrap it up, if they shift the way we read the story from what am I going to do to, oh, what happened? It becomes this passive story we can read rather than a story we're supposed to inhabit, right? Because in a certain sense, we're being asked, what are we going to do? Are we going to flee because we're scared? What do the women do? They flee the tomb. They run away. Or are we going to follow Jesus? I think it's actually where we're supposed to go. So it's more than just a report of what happened with Jesus. It's not just a biography. We're supposed to put ourselves into a story and say, we're supposed to have been doing that all along. We read it as like, I'm one of the apostles. What would I do here, right? And of course, just like the apostles, we're oftentimes pretty dumb, right? If we don't know what we're supposed to do, we get it wrong, we could misunderstand, right? So, I mean, it's actually supposed to end without closure, because this is an ongoing story. All of us are being asked, what are we going to do? Right? It also, I think, helps us think about who Jesus is, right? Or at least we're supposed to ask where he is, right? Because I think this is why I like Mark, right? We don't actually get any resurrection appearances. We just get an empty tomb. And again, we're supposed to ask, what do we do now, right? Where is Jesus. So again, if we go to verse 7, what are we told? He's going ahead of you into Galilee. Or maybe it's literally into Galilee, but it's also this idea of that's where this all started, but if this message is going to spread outside of Jerusalem, that's the next logical place to go would be Galilee. The idea we're going to follow after Jesus. So again, are we going to run away because we're scared? Or are we going to follow him, right? If we want to see him, because he's not in the tomb. Why do they come to the tomb? They want to see him. You got to follow after him if you want to see him. Because
actually, he's there already.
Yeah, he's already ahead of you. Like, yeah, he's on the loose. That's how I like to put it, right? He's out there, right?
Well, when you said your comment on going ahead into Galilee, kind of echoed for me then the structure of Acts, Jerusalem, Judea,
absolutely,
and so on.
Right.
But it's this widening circle of people being drawn in to Jesus. It made me think, if this was written by Kate Quinn, I don't know if you're familiar with Quinn's books, but she writes women's books, and you see women in community. These women in a Kate Quinn book would have said, should we tell them or not? Or maybe we should just keep this to ourselves. Or maybe we should be in charge. And, but it's interesting if you stop to think about it, that Jesus opens his resurrection first to a woman, at least according to John.
Right.
And the news of the resurrection comes to a woman first. And in Luke, there are several references to women, but they're never foregrounded in the way that the male disciples are.
Well, again, I think we have to think of the context and the history, right? One of, to me, the most powerful arguments for the historicity of the resurrection is the actual form of the story, that women are the ones who find out first and make the report. Because if you're going to make this up, this is the worst possible way to do it. Because in the culture of the time, they have no legal standing in court. Like, the women can't be a witness in court.
Well, the reason they were there first was because they started the next direction.
Well, that's maybe true as well. But they're also, it's also a way of painting the disciples of, yes, the women here, it's possible we can read this and say the women are scared, they don't tell anybody. But the apostles are way more scared. They're hiding out. Right? They're not coming to the tomb.
I hate to say this about women, but there's no way a woman can keep a secret. Seriously.
That's right. But I think this is part of the issue. Is like, if you were going to make this up, you wouldn't have the women be the reporter, because they're viewed by the culture of the time as unreliable witnesses. So this isn't a good way to make the story up.
But they were the ones there when he was on the cross.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But I think, again, what I'm trying to get you to see is, like, don't necessarily, yes, I think the Gospels are historically accurate, but at least Mark, that isn't why he's writing. He isn't writing just to tell you a story that you then passively receive. He's writing a manual of discipleship that you're supposed to put yourself in the story all the time. And you get to the ending and you're going to go, what do I do now? The tomb is empty. Jesus is on the loose. Where do I go? What am I going to do? Am I going to hide? Am I going to flee? Or am I going to follow Jesus? And it isn't a one-time thing. It's a everyday thing. Where am I going to go? What am I going to do? Right? So we're being asked: are we going to take up this life of discipleship and follow Jesus, or are we going to flee, or are we going to stay passive and let other people do this? Right? There's all kinds of different ways we could read it. Right? The thing I don't like about the endings, and why I actually don't think they fit the tone of the gospel overall, again, is they wrap it up, right? They give us a story in which we can be passive. Jesus is doing everything. Other people are following him and doing things. We can just kind of sit back, right? Where the original ending puts us in this a spot of how are we going to act? What are we going to do?
Occasionally there are places where he has to talk with the disciples and tells them, you have to pray, you have to faith.
Yep. And again, he's encouraging us to follow him, right? Rather than just sort of be passive receivers, right? So again, this ending works really well. And if we think of this as the purpose of it, if we think this text would have been received orally, and you would then ask questions, this way of ending it makes a lot of sense, right? The endings come in part because people start reading it rather than merely hearing it. Then you kind of need an ending, because you would have gotten an ending orally. A reader would have told you what happened. They would have kind of like then explained it, and you would have been able to ask questions. And of course, you would already know, right? Because why did you go to a church service in the first place to hear this read? You probably already heard the ending in some way before, right? Because again, these Gospels aren't there to call people for the first time. It's not so much evangelism as it is catechesis. You're being called to be a disciple, right? So this is just, let's go fun with the ending here, right? Dale.
In the long ending.
Yep.
And I'm not clear on all this, but
Yep.
it sounds like it's heavily influenced by John's.
Yes, I think it is too.
Among other things, the rebuking of them at the table and so on. But the story of the two people on the way to Emmaus, is that John or is that Luke?
Road to Emmaus is Luke.
Luke.
Yep.
So there's evidence that whoever's compiling this,
I think
both John and Luke.
I think they probably have all three of the other Gospels and Acts, and they've taken all four of them and like written a nice ending for us that shows everybody agrees. That's kind of what's happened. Yeah. But I think John probably is a major influence. So verse 17, we get this language of signs. That's not Mark's term. He doesn't use that term. That's a John term, right? And notice what those verses do. So rather than kind of call us to follow Jesus and put this sort of like this call on us, say, what are you going to do? We get to pat ourselves on the back and say, and these signs will accompany those who could believe, right? So they get to do all these things, right? Rather than sort of putting this, again, urgency on us to what are we going to do? Are we going to follow Jesus, right?
So the snake business.
Yeah.
That shows up here.
Yeah.
It must just be something taken out of Acts.
Well, yeah, I think that's what it is, right? Is we Paul gets bit by a snake when they're on the island, and he doesn't die, and it's a miracle, right? And so, again, what happens here is a miracle is like speaking in tongues, casting out demons, picking up snakes, right? Drinking poison, become signs that bear witness to the power that we have. Jesus doesn't ever operate that way. He doesn't use his power to show off, ever. He uses it to help people. And in fact, he goes, shh, don't tell anybody what I'm up to, because I don't have time to do this for everybody, in a certain sense. He's like, I've got a job to do. As he goes along, he'll help people. But he doesn't want to get turned into a magic worker, a wonder worker. Right? Yeah, but even there, like if we read Acts, right, the apostles, they do miracles. They don't ever do them to show off. That they usually get pulled into doing them. Right? The power's always there to help, not to sort of demonstrate, hey, look what we can do, right? So this actually distorts these endings. Yeah.
But in Hebrews, like it says, and about Jesus and the sharing of the word, it was accompanied by signs.
Yeah.
So in Hebrews, the miracles are there for a sign. There was a book back in the 80s, 90s about evangelism going on like in Indonesia and all the miracles that were going along with that. And then at that time, we weren't in the Pentecostal movement. We never went that far. I never could speak in tongues. So I was always a little bit lower class when we were hanging out with Pentecostals. But it seems like the different Pentecostal groups base a lot of their confidence on this and Acts. And you get down to Appalachia, and they really away some of it.
But again, I think what's important to focus on, so even the Hebrews book, yes, there are signs there, but in Hebrews, those signs are always fulfillment of prophecy. So the signs are for insiders, not outsiders. Signs are there, I'll get there in a second, those signs are there to confirm the faith for people who are already in the community, right? When Jesus does do miracles, he's helping people. They're never like, look what I can do, this is why you should become part of our movement. In fact, when people don't believe, the miracles get smaller. Or he says, I can't do them, especially in Mark, right? So they're not there to pull people in. They're there to help the people who are already in.
Seek for a sign.
Yeah.
But Jesus rebukes people
for seeking signs.
Always seeking signs.
Because again, what are they asking for? They're asking for proof.
Yeah, so
rather than having a faith, right? But that's the whole thing with the sign. I mean, the signs are there in a certain sense for the insiders to be able to have their faith confirmed. Look, he's fulfilling prophecy, right? But they aren't ever there to prove to the doubter, come in. I mean, that's actually what Jesus ends up saying, like, you always look for a sign. The wicked generation looks for a sign, right? Of, you want your faith proved before you believe. Jesus says, I don't operate that way. In fact, if you start to doubt, the signs will get less and less, right? And I think that actually proves the point. He isn't using them to evangelize. Dave?
The story of the fig tree.
The fig tree is a great story. It's, I think, Mark gets it best. He gets what gets so. If you read it in Mark, I think it's chapter 14. Mark does his typical thing. This is his favorite way to tell a story. He has sandwiches. He's got a story, piece of bread. Another story starts before the first one's done. And then we get the end of the first story. He does this all the time. So think of the double miracle story of the synagogue leader wants his son healed. And while he's on the way to the house, the woman who's bleeding comes. We get that story. And then we get the end of the first story. Mark does this constantly, right? What is that story doing? Part of what it's saying is a synagogue leader, the higher up person, ought to be the one who has faith, but he doesn't. He demands Jesus come and put his hands on his kid. Or the woman is just like, I'm going to go touch him and he'll take care of it herself. So she's actually being put forward as the one who really has a faith. So he does these kinds of stories all the time. What's happening with the fig tree is, where does it occur? What happened before, what happens after? He's in the temple. So before the story is when he cleanses the temple. Then we get the story of the fig tree. And then he goes back to the temple. Right? What that story is doing is, this is why I actually think Mark is the most difficult gospel to kind of grasp what he's doing. It's the most sophisticated. Is what we're being told with that is, a fig tree, Jesus is angry at the tree because it doesn't have a fruit, even though we're told it's not a season for figs, right? It's not fair for Jesus to curse this tree. It's like us saying, my tomato plant doesn't have any tomatoes on it in February, right? But what we're being told is the tree doesn't have any fruit. Well, we've been told the stories all along the gospel, and getting to that point of when things don't bear fruit, they get destroyed. The fig tree doesn't bear fruit, it gets destroyed. Well, the temple isn't bearing any fruit. That's what's really happening. The temple is now, it's a false. It's going to be destroyed. Where is God's presence found now? Not in the temple, but in the person of Jesus. But he's doing that by telling us these stories, and we have to figure it out. But that's how it operates. Again, I think the person telling the story would have explained it originally. All we've got is like the base text that you then riff off. This is why I said the other day, I like to think of Mark as like, it's a jazz. You've got a kind of a basic piece of a score, but you're being encouraged to sort of riff off it all the time. So you take this story, then you explain it, and you unpack it. It's meant to do that. Whereas, if you look at Matthew and Luke and even John, they oftentimes take the time to explain to us what's happening. Dale.
This is a little bit of a side question, but I'm intrigued by the young man who leaves his robe behind in the garden and flees naked, and yet Mark doesn't tell us that it is Peter who cuts off the ear.
Yeah.
I've always thought that the kid that runs away naked is Mark himself. To say that he was there, I know this now. But you would think if it's Peter's gospel, then Peter would be featured, but that comes out in Matthew.
Right.
So I guess I'm asking, why does he not name Peter, or why is Peter not named?
So I think, again, this is where we should read. Has there been a minor editing happen? Right. In the gospel as a whole, Peter's kind of portrayed as the thickest of the apostles. Right. The densest. Right. He's the one who doesn't get it the most, even though he's the head. Like, it's almost like this reverse thing of he's the one closest to Jesus, so he gets it the least. Right. Who gets it the most? The demons get it the most. They're the ones who really know who Jesus is. The Pharisees and the Sadducees, they begin to get who Jesus is, and they want him gone. Right? So I think this is part of the story, right? And so when Peter gets kind of lifted up here in the end, I think that's actually not Peter's authentic voice. That's people afterwards trying to lift Peter up.
Do you think Mark is the boy?
It's Mark or it's John. Because John is the youngest, right? Actually, because John is present at the crucifixion. He's the only disciple who's there. Probably because he's a teenage boy. Because the other disciples, probably the reason why they aren't there is they're adults who would probably be arrested on the spot. And they would have put up another cross, and that's where they would be. Because the women can be there because they're not a threat, and John can be there because he's just a kid. So that's possibly the other person who it is. And again, it actually kind of tells us how he ends up there. He gets scared, and someone pulls on his robe, and he just shimmies out of it and takes off. Right? Anyway, well, we don't have time for the other stories. So, but I mean, again, this is what I'm encouraging you to see is when you read the Gospel of Mark again, don't read it as just a report. It's not a history book. The story of Jesus is being told in a way where I'm supposed to put myself into a story, not as a Jesus, but as one of the apostles, and ask myself all along, who am I? What I was going to do with the parable of the sower is to see, we get the seeds that fall on the bad soil and the ones on the good soil, right? This isn't always. It isn't like, well, sorry, you fell on the path, so you're going to hell, and you fell amongst the thorns, so you're going to hell, right? It's always, constantly, we could be good soil or bad soil. Like all of us experience this. Are we following Jesus? Are we being good disciples? Are we bearing fruit? Or are we in the bad soil where we aren't bearing fruit? Because all these other concerns have taken us away from following Jesus. Right? So again, the whole thing is about, am I going to follow Jesus or not? Am I going to do it well or not? Right? That's how the gospel actually operates. So, okay, see you next week. And hopefully tonight.